So you talked earlier about when you went to the police academy, it was 12 weeks. You got to go home on the weekends. I don't really want to get into specifically what you learn in police academy over 12 weeks, but when you're out of police academy, what are you doing? And you just told me a story about basically you had an officer who you were showing that for the first time how to pull somebody over, right?
Mm-hmm.
What is the I don't, maybe it's on the job training. We used to call it OJT in the military,
Mm-hmm.
right? What is some of that kind of training that you do, and what does the ongoing training look like for an officer in a town in New England?
Well, it would be different for each officer depending on whether or not they had already been to the academy and then they're just moving to our department, or how long they had been here training with us before the academy started. But typically, they would spend 18 or 19 weeks at the academy, and then they would have to do 12 to 16 weeks here in training also. And then once they're trained, they'd have to be cleared by the chief and lieutenant to go out on the road alone. But during that time they're training, they'd have to spend time with the FTO, the field training officer, and they'd have to spend time with the sergeant, and they'd have to spend a little time with each of the officers so they could get a little time on different shifts, and then they'd have to, again, clear working with the lieutenant and then finally be signed off by the chief in that
Okay.
12 to 16 week time period.
Okay. So if you've been an officer for maybe 3, 4, 5 years, and you've already been through that process, you've got a couple of years experience working on your own. Maybe there isn't a clear standard across the board. I know there's not nationally, and maybe there's not statewide, but in your department and in departments that you've worked for in the past, what kind of ongoing training do you have for seasoned or experienced officers? I mean, I would assume that there's PT tests ever so often. I would assume that you have to do marksmanship tests ever so often. What other kind of things do you guys have to do as ongoing training, even throughout your career?
Well, it's mandatory training. So the Maine Criminal Justice Academy has mandatory training that's put out. There's certain training that we have to do that's required every year by the end of December each year. So we have, like you mentioned, mandatory firearms training, and we have mandatory law updates, criminal and traffic law updates.
And is that like a classroom type training?
It's online now. It used to be classroom. Now it's online. We have Supreme Court decisions, any type of major court case decisions that come down that year. You have to understand. You have to read the case law and understand and know what those changes are. Then you have to have they pick certain classes that you have to take, and they're typically online. You have to take those, and they decide 2 or 3 years ahead of time, so you know which classes you have to take for the next 2 or 3 years coming up. And then you have to take a minimum of another, like, we'll call it like electives, where you have to take another 20 hours of training. It's really, if you think about it, not a lot. They are adding to that. Most departments, I can't say most, I can speak for our department, we have a lot more training than that. We have a large training budget, so our officers will typically have 40 to 80 hours instead of just that minimum 20. They'll have 40 to 80, some even have more than that. So if they take a 2-week course, they have 80. We try to get.
And so when are they doing this training? Is it like just on their own time, or is it like during downtime when they're on a shift? Or, I mean, if it's online, are they sitting there with their laptop on their shift doing it, or?
So if they have a course that they need to go to, like at the academy, we'll pull them out of rotation, out of their shift rotation, and we'll have somebody else cover them. Cover it as overtime, and they'll go up to the academy and go to a class. So it might be a 1-week class or a 2-week class, or it could be a 2-day class. They'll actually go there instead of come to work. Sometimes if it's like an online class and it's a 3 or 4 hour class, but it's online, they can do it like in 30-minute snippets here and there. If it's a quiet day or a quiet night at work, they can do, 30 minutes or so online at a time and get through that 4-hour class over the course of a week or two. But to answer your question, that depends. Usually they'll take a day off work and go to training. If it's firearms, usually they'll come in on a day off. A few of them will come in at once and then go and do their firearms training.
Okay, so you've talked about online training. It sounds like you've talked about basically law updates, and you've talked about firearms training. Are there any other types of training that they get that that your average civilian wouldn't necessarily think of? I mean, do they get any training in psychology or anything like that, or what kind of training do they get in interpersonal skills and?
They get their verbal judo classes. They get.
And is that like an official name? Because I've heard that term before.
Yeah, they call it verbal judo.
Okay.
And they get, it's like de-escalation techniques.
Okay.
They get CIT training, which is crisis intervention training. When people are having.
I assume that has to have some sort of psychological aspect to it.
Right. It's crisis intervention. So they get that type of training. They get MARC training, which stands for Mechanics of Arrest, Restraint, and Control, which that is the early, the beginning of the jiu-jitsu type training. The jiu-jitsu.
Well, that doesn't sound like online training, though, is it?
No. Well, no, you were saying other types of training. CIT training is not online. The crisis intervention, that's not online. You actually go and you speak to people who have needed crisis intervention training, and they talk about what types of things trigger them, what types of things you should and shouldn't do if they're having some type of event, what types of things trigger them. Speak to several different people that have had mental health issues and have conversations with them. They're typically people that are afraid of or have issues with police, and they'll have conversations with us. That's usually, we do yearly training on that. The MARC training, that's hands-on. The Mechanics of Arrest, Restraint, Control. Those are jiu-jitsu trained instructors that do that.
So that's hands-on. That's practice. They actually go to a gym, get on a mat, and practice moves, right? And they do that how often?
Well, they used to just do it in the academy, and then they didn't require you do it after that, which isn't realistic. Now they're going to start requiring that we do it every year.
Okay. Okay, let's go from training to budget. I think that's a natural transition. I would assume, as a chief, you probably have a large part in dealing with the budget of your department. I would guess that's your real ultimate responsibility. How do you see your budget? And, can you share with us any rough percentages of your budget that are attributed to, buying cruisers and keeping them gassed up and mechanically okay, and buying tires, versus how much is done to keep the lights on here, and how much is put towards training, how much is put towards jiu-jitsu or the MARC training, that kind of stuff? Like, where does the biggest part of your budget go?
Well, the biggest part of my budget goes to payroll.
Okay.
That's the largest part of my budget.
If you were to guess, in percentages, or in, let's say it's a half or 3/4 or 2/3 of your budget, what percentage of your budget goes to payroll?
More than half.
More than half, okay. So of the half that's left, what's your next biggest expenditure?
Or
one of the bigger ones.
one of the next biggest would be equipment, as in police cars and outfitting those cars. The cars themselves they can be $50,000-$60,000, and you've got to equip them. You've got to put the lights or radios, the cages. That can get expensive. It can be $10,000-$20,000 to outfit a vehicle, depending on what you're running on that vehicle. And then you run the miles up pretty quick on them. Fuel is another thing that's expensive. you know, I can spend $20,000 a year on fuel, and I'm a small department. I mean, large departments, I'm sure, are spending a couple $100,000, you know, if not $500,000 a year in fuel. Fuel is a lot. Our training budget is pretty high. We're fortunate. Most departments 4 times our size don't have the training budget we have. You know, I have to put a lot of emphasis on education.
And why is that? Is that specifically up to the chief of the department?
Well, I mean, the chief puts forth the budget, and then the town or city manager approves it. That's the first place you have to get it approved, and then your town or city council, your select board members, whatever type of government you're running, they have to then approve it. Your town or your city has to, you know, vote it through. So it's not just one place.
So with all those different ecosystems going on, you could have 2 different police departments that are practically neighboring each other that would have very different budgets and very different expenditures on what they, you know, one might spend a lot on training, one might not.
Right.
And is there any maybe state regulatory authority or anything like that that kind of oversees that? And does anybody ever oversee a police department and say, hey, y'all aren't spending enough on training, or hey, y'all are spending too much on these cars? I mean,
No, the police academy, the Maine Criminal Justice Academy decides what our minimum training standards are. So they say you will do law updates each year, you will do a minimum of 20 hours of electives, pick something, you will do a minimum of crisis intervention each year, you will do mark training every other year, you will do firearms once a year. You know, they give us our basics, and outside of that, I mean, we can do.
And do they send, I mean, is there any sort of situation where you're audited to make sure that you're actually keeping up with those standards? What does that look like?
I have to do what they call end of year chief's report, and that's due the 1st of January, the first week of January, and it's that whole prior year, and I have to put everything together in a packet and send it to the academy, and they look that over, and I have to sign it, and if it's not accurate, if there's anything on there that's not accurate, then I can be decertified. So I, you know, would be decertified, lose my commission as a police officer and as chief of police, and I would be done. So when chiefs fill that paperwork out for their department, they have to be accurate, and they have to be 100% certain that what they put on that paperwork is true.
Okay.
That they've actually done that training, you know, that their officers have actually done it, and it took place prior to December 31st. If even one officer doesn't have it done, and they do it on January 2nd, and the chief puts on the paperwork, yeah, it was done December 31st, you'll lose your commission.
You lose your job.
Yep.
So I know budgets, I mean, by definition, are because we have a lack of resources, and that's just a fact of economics. There's always going to be a lack of resources. But do you think you have enough money to do the job that you do? I mean, is it just one of those things where it's difficult, or do you feel like you're in a position where it's impossible, or is it easy? I don't know. You tell me. How do you feel?
Do I have enough? Have I been given enough money in my budget?
Have you been given enough resources to do what the state and the... No, we don't. And do you,
don't have enough.
You know, obviously you're only seeing this from one perspective, but from your perspective, do you see a reason behind that? I mean, why aren't you given the budget that you need?
Well, you know, this year it's been difficult because of COVID, and for a multitude of reasons, it's made it difficult. But you know, it just really comes down to priorities. I happen to be a chief in a small town, and even though the townspeople might want the police department to have more, we have to get through the select board first. And even though the town manager might think that the police department needs more, we still have to get through the select board, and it's very political. And I happen to be I believe, it's all part of my perception too. I happen to be of the belief that I'm fighting against a select board member that doesn't want a female police chief, and he's doing everything that he can to make it difficult. So that hasn't helped. So that's been difficult. I've been up against that since I became chief. You just have to take what they give you and do what you can with it.